Veteran South American soccer correspondent Tim Vickery, now with the BBC, describes Chapecoense as the mouse that kept on roaring. I spoke to him, he's in Rio de Janeiro, and we began by talking about the fact that as well as the team and its managers, the plane had almost 24 journalists and commentators on board going with the team to cover the game, some of them people Tim Vickery knew.
That's right, and this is the story of the decimation of a football club. But as well as being the biggest tragedy in Brazil's sporting history, it's the biggest tragedy in the history of the Brazilian press. Obviously, the football team is centered around one city, the small town of Chapecó, which has played witness to this extraordinary fairy tale rise of this small town club from a club who were barely household names in their own home a decade ago, to a club competing for a South American title, the first Brazilian club to do so in 3 years. But the journalists, the death of the journalists gives it more of a national dimension. And the ones that I knew came from my adopted home city in Rio, because the TV channel that broadcasts the games is based in Rio. So that has made the tragedy more national. And people are feeling this all over Brazil, because the story of Chapecoense, the extraordinary rise of Chapecoense, has been such a great story that it's touched the hearts of Brazilians up and down this giant country. But the death of the journalists has taken it to another level, I think.
There's a stunning photo on the BBC's website at the moment of the stadium, and there's just a little boy sitting there taking stock on his own. I guess he's about 10 years old. And what you notice is not only the beautiful image of the boy, grief-stricken, but also actually how cheap the stadium looks. I mean, this was such a Cinderella story, wasn't it? This was a team that came from nothing with very little money, and the superstars of Brazilian football were playing elsewhere. It was such a great story until now.
Well, 10 years ago, Chapecoense nearly stopped existing, and they weren't even part of Brazil's 4 professional divisions at that time. It's a relatively small town. That stadium that you're referring to is so small that the second leg of the final, they were travelling up to Medellin for the first leg of the final against Atlético Nacional of Colombia. The second leg, which would have been in Brazil next week, they couldn't stage that in their own stadium because it was deemed too small. So their supporters would have had to have travelled some 250 miles to another stadium. So this really was a fairy tale story. There's an article on the website of CONMEBOL. CONMEBOL is the South American equivalent of UEFA. It's the football organising body here. And there's an article on its website that with the title, "The Adventure of Chapecoense Astonishes a Continent." And unfortunately, this latest tragic, deeply horrific turn in the adventure has indeed astonished not just a continent, but the world. And the world of footballers has really felt this. I think footballers and football clubs and football journalists and so on, wherever they're from, they can all relate to this because they have a tendency to get on a lot of planes. So we've really seen an emotional response from a global football family. And no more so than obviously the 2 clubs involved. And as we speak, that stadium there in Chapecó, the Arena Condá, is full. That's where the people have flocked. It's where they need to be together, feeling their loss on a collective basis. The stadium in Medellin, where the game was to have taken place tomorrow, Atlético Nacional there will open the doors of their stadium at the time when the game would have taken place, and they are calling their supporters to come, flock to the stadium to pay tribute to those who have lost their lives. And Atlético Nacional have made a formal offer, a formal request rather, to the authorities that the trophy be handed to Chapecoense. It's a magnificent gesture because that is not just a symbolic tribute to those who lost their lives. It also has practical consequences. It means that Chapecoense qualify for the main event in club football in this part of the world. It's called the Copa Libertadores. It's our version of the Champions League. So it guarantees Chapecoense revenue, and that they badly need now to restructure, to go through the difficult business of reconstructing their club. I know that these things at this stage are not the priority. The priority is treating those 6 survivors, some of whom it seems have very severe injuries, and recovering and identifying the bodies of the 71 people who lost their lives. But we also need to look beyond that, and I think this gesture by Atlético Nacional really emphasises and exemplifies the solidarity which is coming from the football community all across the world.
That's the BBC's veteran South American correspondent, a soccer correspondent, Tim Vickery, talking about a team he covered, a Cinderella kind of story until that terrible tragedy. And men he knew, journalists, commentators that he knew and were amongst his friends.